who am I? I am a Salesforce technical architect at United Health Group. I actually specialize in there. I actually work with employee occupational health and safety. And so the Salesforce instance that we have does things like our employee vaccine and exemption program, our COVID case management and tracking processes, our flu program for flu vaccination. For those who don't know, the healthcare world is really kind of standard that people have to keep up with vaccinations. So we are also migrating off a legacy system and process that handles things like regular TB testing and mask fitting and other stuff like that that's required to keep people safe. And so I work with an environment where we're really kind of in the middle of employee health and safety for healthcare, which also actually helps drive better healthcare outcomes. So it's kind of a nice impact there. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I'm one of the community group co-leaders of Charlottesville. I have 14 certifications, application architect. I've been on a break for them for a while, so hopefully I will get back to that from the neighboring former used to run the Waterloo developer group before we went to Salesforce. Sudipta Deb has now just passed me, so I now need to get back on that. I am fortunate enough to be a 4-time Salesforce MVP, and I am a Rad Woman code coach, and just started with my 5th cohort this time, I think. Yeah. Find me out there on Twitter at TechForecastIs. Find me on the Trailblazer community. Trailblazer ID is there. That also has LinkedIn and my website. I used to be a Lightning Champion back when there was a Lightning Champion program, and then it became a Platform Champion. Then it became a former Platform Champions program as they killed it. I'm also joining the Salesforce Automation Council, where we're kind of directly connecting with a lot of the product team to help bring out new features, understand what's going on, give feedback, etc. Sounds like we've got a mix of people here, so I will try to spend a little bit of time on these items here from the beginning and try to discuss what flow is. And let me put this into slideshow mode so it's easier for everyone to see. So Salesforce flows went by a bunch of different names in time. They used to be called Lightning Flows. They used to have a classic flow version that was built on Flash. People were happy to see that flow builder go. And then the new flow builder came in and was pretty, but didn't have a lot of the same functionality. And then they came out with this auto layout thing. It's been a time of fun, but these have the interactive screen components or backend automations, and they're built using a visual programming interface that's called Flow Builder. And one of the things I really want to highlight is the distinction between Process Builder and Flow, or workflow rules and Flow, is massive, because one is a basic state change engine. If this, then this, then this type of thing, and that's Process Builder. Same with workflow rules, except for they were if this, then this. They did one thing. Process Builder, you could chain a couple different actions together. Flow is a process engine. It is a full functioning programming language that just happens to be visual. It has variables you can assign. It has loop flexibility. It can read records, write records, get new records, process them. There's a lot of things about Flow that are built in here, and it pays attention to think of it as you would a programming language, because it really is, in a lot of ways, your traditional model view controller programming area. And that's one reason why a lot of admins struggle with it at first, and a lot of developers struggle with it from a completely different reason, because you're used to having more control when you write your code and more flexibility in how you do things. But it's still very much a programming language, and there's still a lot of the same concepts that apply. So there are multiple categories for flows. And basically I define them into 2 categories. You have your front-end flows that are user interactive. These can be, think of it like your TurboTax wizard is the one that everyone compares it to, guides you through questions, takes you through this, lets you do this. There's lots of cool other things you can do with them, though. And then there's the back-end flows. These are process automations. These are like your workflow rules, your process builder, but they can also do a lot more than those are. And only the screen one is user interactive. All these others are back-end. There's no other user interactive version other than a screen flow right now. So Screenflows, again, they're interactive. You can leverage other flows. You can use those backend flows. You can also use Lightning components to create a custom interface. You can use custom Lightning components to create a custom interface. Schedule triggered flows, these are a little bit like your general scheduled class batch Apex code that you run behind the scenes. One note here is they don't use the exact same infrastructure as that batch Apex and scheduled Apex. They are a completely owned set of limits and rules and runtime right now that's going to be transitioned. But in the meantime, you kind of have to think of it as its own thing because it doesn't necessarily follow the same rules that those do. There are auto-launched flows. Basically, this is I think of it kind of a misnomer, but it's there for the duration at this point. Basically, this is a flow that is meant to be called by something else. It does not have anything that makes it automatically run. It's not based on doesn't have a schedule, doesn't have a record change. It has to be run by something else. But the auto-launch flows are really good for making subflows. They can also be called from Apex code. So you can have things where your Apex code can call an auto-launch flow. I don't like this a whole lot, and we'll talk about that in a second. The most common one out there that people are coming to right now is this record triggered flows. They are extremely powerful automation tool. They are caused by record change of some sort. So they follow basically very much the same as a trigger. They can be run in a context of before. They can be run in a context of after. And Salesforce has some funky new names for those. But basically, they run in a context, and they also can happen with delete as an action. So you can have the created, updated, and deleted and see all those together. This is a big thing. It's a big shift, and this is where you can kind of swap out your process builder. You can swap out your workflow rules with this. You can swap out other flows with this, and in some cases, you can swap out triggers with this, with caution. Then there's another way that I would prefer if I'm linking and calling from code. Auto-launch flows are great if you're working with them in the builder, but when you're dealing with code, one of the things is they become a confined dependency. Your auto launch flow is essentially hard coded in there. So you're deliberately saying, go here and run this flow. And I don't really like that for a bunch of different reasons because it is problematic to work with and it becomes a dependency and you need to change the flow. You need to change this. You have to go in and update your code. You have to go back and retest everything. You may have to go change this. You may have to rewrite your test classes. The better way that I like to do this, if I'm running some type of code that needs to call a flow, I will use a platform event triggered flow. And these respond to a platform event. And platform events could be generated by Apex. They can be generated by flows. They can be generated by outside integrations. MuleSoft can trigger a platform event from outside. They can come from a Lightning component using Comet D to put stuff in there. They are a flexible way of working with stuff. And they're kind of like an event-driven bus. And so the idea is you put a publisher on the bus and you put a listener on the bus or multiple listeners on the bus, and you don't have to really pay attention to what's happening. The publisher doesn't need to know which listener is going forward. The listener doesn't care what publisher it is. So if you have to work with Apex, if you end up switching it and coming out from an external integration source, whatever, you have a way to work with these without having to rely on specific code. So the thing is, platform events are really easy to make. And when you're talking about platform event triggered flows, you would basically set up a platform event. This looks just like setting up another object. You're giving it fields, but the fields have a couple limitations on type. You are specifying them in the same way because essentially what you're giving is sort of a JSON serialized description of an object here. And basically here we've just got a couple of events that were created for Inc. And they add an event to that process builder bus. And it's a error message to the printer and everything else. And the nice thing about the way this is set up here for this code, the nice thing about this is it's one, again, pretty easy and readable. It's pretty straightforward to publish. And two, the nice thing is this doesn't care what's listening to it. This could be a flow that creates a task, whatever. The advantage here, though, is if you have code that has to do something really complex and push stuff out, you can actually have something that passes it to your admin to finish it the rest of the way, that they can configure it and customize the business logic and what gets done with that information you publish, working with your business side of things more closely. And the advantage here is that you can keep your stuff much more flexible. So you create the code that publishes the events, and they're free to work with multiple platform event triggered flows that they want. They can work with different things that put it in different areas. They can use a lot of that to be able to come in. So this is kind of a secret superpower, and it's a great integration pattern for being able to design services so that you don't have to send tightly couple it and hard code in. We're going to use this flow today. We're going to use this flow tomorrow. It's a lot more straightforward and easy. Any questions on the platform event triggered flows or stuff like that, or the general flows before we plunge on into other topics? I'm going to take that as a no, or I've already put you all to sleep. Not sure which one.
Just want to say I love platform events.
Yes, it's a big decoupling, and I am looking forward to the day when they have a proper pub sub API on the outside for Salesforce so that you can have a lot more seamless of message bus passing than what we've got right now. But that is definitely over a year off from what I last heard. So getting into flow basics. So within flow, you have
Mark,
stuff.
Sorry to interrupt you. Monica in the chat is asking, can you give us a few examples of platform event usage?
Sure. So one example that I have of this is we actually have on our website where I work, where we collect information from people via form. That form is produced by a number of Lightning components. And we actually have, they produce one output together, and that actually gets published as a platform event, and it sends it off to the bus. And we have experimented with different kinds of listeners. So, sometimes we have to prototype quickly and work through things, and we're able to modify stuff on the platform event triggered flows much quicker than we can modify the code, especially if we know it's something new and we have to change it really often. A lot of cases we actually take and we modify that. So taking data from forms is a good example. Taking data from external systems is a good example. Long-running processes like queuable exercises and stuff like that. A lot of cases, stuff that you may have running in the background, things that may call out to an integration and send something back. A lot of cases, that kind of asynchronous stuff really works well with a platform event because it comes back in. And again, you have your one thing that listens out there, right? This one piece of code got the message that says, go call this API for this information. And when you get it back, send it back to me. And so it comes back in and it may call this API, and the API is the flavor of turkey sandwich in the cafeteria today, right? And it just checks back in it. There may be all sorts of listeners that are interested in what flavor turkey sandwich is there today. Is it honey? Is it Cajun? Is it whatever, right? So what ends up happening is that device, that service gets a call that says, hey, update this. And so it goes out and gets that information, and it bundles it back up, and it puts it out there for the publisher. And it publishes out there on the event bus. And everything on the event bus, there could be a listener that is a chef salad listener, and it says, oh, this is the salad. This is what I want to use this and prepare. There could be another listener that is the sandwich listener. There could be another one that says, wow, this is not good. Let me get the vegetarian option. So you can have multiple listeners on there. They're all getting the same information about what kinds of things are available in the cafeteria that day. But what happens is, from an asynchronous perspective, this service gets a message saying it needs to call out. It calls out, it gets all that information, pushes it back, and it pushes out on the bus. And every one of those listeners on the bus, which could be a flow, it could be Apex code, etc., is listening and gets the information back. And so it can do its own thing with that data without having to understand where it came from, what happens. So the nice thing is, if I have to completely retrofit my Apex code, I don't have to retrofit everything else. My platform event just takes it and goes out to everything else. They don't know what produced it, and my platform event creating service doesn't know what's listening to it, and it doesn't need to. So because they're decoupled, it makes it a lot easier to migrate, makes it a lot easier to manage changes against, and it makes it a lot easier to be a lot more flexible with different teams working on different things. And especially the fact that you have an event-triggered flow means you can now have more of the admin or declarative developers doing a lot of things with the data you're already getting for other stuff from your code. Does that make sense?
She just responded in the chat. Great examples. Thank you. Especially the sandwich analogy. Yes.
Yeah, it takes, I've been trying to figure out, I came up with that on the spot. So it was a little bit rough, but it works. All right, so what makes up a flow? So there are some key elements to flow, the data elements, and this is part of your basic criteria. It is your create records or DML insert. It is update records, DML update, get records, SQL query, delete records, DML delete, rollback records. Ooh, that's a new one. So this rollback records just came out. And one of the things is, with Apex, you've had that option of having code where it runs as all or none, or having it complete which ones it can and just erring on the ones that it can't, right? We've had that option on our DML if we went from a DML statement to, calling our database class for database.insert, database.whatever, right? We've had that option. Flows didn't have that. They ran for whatever records they had, and if they hit an error message to stop the whole process, well, everything that wasn't run wasn't run, but the ones that did, they're done. They're over. So this rollback records is new. And the real advantage here is that this makes it so you do not have to complete your process. Like if it needs to be everything or nothing, you actually have the option to roll back records here. And that's really cool. The other thing is where this comes in handy is potentially in Screenflows, because a lot of cases what you may have happen is Screenflow, update, Screenflow, update, Screenflow, update. Because a lot of cases you need to update data back to that record so you can process it. Well, what happens if you get all the way to the end of your process that you're guiding someone through on their TurboTax and they turn around and go, never mind, cancel? Well, this rollback records comes in handy to be able to do that. So this is the equivalent of the database.insert all or none flag. It is a welcome addition. This is brand new in spring 22. A lot of people who even use flows on a regular basis have no idea about this one. Logic elements. So these are your controller, basically, in the world of the MVC model, right? Your previous data elements are very much your model piece. So within here, we have our logic elements. Assignment. Same thing as with a variable. It's just a way of setting one thing equal to another thing. And assignments can be variables that you create in Flow. Assignments can be record details, same as you have an instantiated variable that represents an object and a record. Decisions are if, then, else versions. Loops are your classic for loop. And it's the classic of for spanning over a set of records. Doesn't really have a counter built into it. You can make a counter built into it, but usually it works across a list of records. Collection sort came back out in winter, and this is a huge thing because prior to that, there was no way to sort your results to process them in a certain order. That was an issue for a lot of people, and one reason why people had to keep making Apex-related actions to work with this. The other reason why people kept having to make Apex-related actions was collection filtering, and that's because a loop in Flow is not as efficient as a loop in Apex. There's a couple reasons why, but a loop in Flow is just not as efficient as it is in Apex. And because they kind of work with different models and different limits on certain things, you are more likely to have a process fail because it had too many records entering into a loop. So the new one is this collection filter action. And there'd already been Apex-based actions that you could do with this, but this one includes it in the out-of-the-box tool set. And so now you don't need to include a loop in your Flow just to filter those records and get the ones you want. You just throw this element in there and say, all right, the ones that match this criteria go in this collection. Yay, we're done. I talked to the developer through working with this just the other day because she had a thing that was in her criteria, and it came into a collection. She's like, well, no, I just need the ones that have this, this, and this. Okay, well, why are you doing a loop within a loop within a loop? Don't do that. This collection filter saves time, saves processing, saves the planet. You can be a superhero by using this appropriately. Then there's advanced elements. And I don't know why. Screenflows aren't advanced, and they are advanced. Your screen components aren't advanced, and they are advanced. So the first point, we're going to talk about the basics. And from there, we're going to kind of go into their not really advanced. The actions and subflows, these are where you get into more of advancements here. Actions are invokable Apex code that you can use and run and feed that data into your flow. And there's some really cool things about that come up that are super helpful. Subflows are kind of the same. These are auto-launched flows that you can use to run again and again and again. You can make them reusable. You can avoid trying to reduplicate everything on the planet. For example, one of the ones I see all the time is people create an error logging action or an error logging set in their flow. And they create it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. All right, that is something that can go into a subflow because you can call it, you can use it and do it the same way every time. So subflows are really just like your regular flows. These can't have screen elements in them, or they can't have screen elements in them if they're being called by a screen flow. If they're being called by any of the others, they cannot have screen elements in them, and Salesforce may yell at you. So when we talk about the basic elements, screen flows are the basis of interaction with end users. This is where it displays things, where you can put on components that represent different fields. You can do all kinds of things with screen flows. They are really useful, but they are sort of limited out of the box. They have some really hard limits to run into. So, for example, there is no way to show a data table in a flow out of the box. None. No way to show a data table. Not even the equivalent. If you wanted to do a data table once upon a time and you wanted to be in flow, you literally had to build your own component that called Lightning Dash Data Table as an LWC and throw it in there. And even then, as a lot of us know, Lightning Dash Data Table leaves a lot to be desired as far as functionality goes. But the screen elements are kind of the basis of tying it in from a user interactive perspective. And you can still do a lot. And they are constantly working on these out-of-the-box ones, making them more flexible, making them more usable, taking in a lot of design stuff. So it constantly keeps changing. You may have to kind of keep an eye on it as it goes through, but that's your basic element. Flow Explorer is the brand new thing in Spring 22. And this, as I was mentioning, allows you to take your record-triggered flows and you can organize them, you can sort them, you can see, are they running before a flow, which is what they decided to call, or before a save or update, which is the fast field updates is what they decided to call. And fortunately for us in the Flow Explorer, they finally put in run before save. And of course, this is on created. So it shows that your individual flow can be set to run on created or updated, and it will show based on the list here of which one you have chosen. But it doesn't, you don't need to make two different flows for created and updated. Sometimes it's a good idea, not always. You can choose the after save. This is actions and related records. This is the same logic as an after trigger. After insert, after update, after delete. It's the same concept here. All that is just a way to say that this has been saved. So now we have a record ID to work with. Same thing as with others. You look at it and go, if it needs to have a record ID and work with related records, it needs to be actions and related records. If it's something that needs to be, or that can be done before a save happens, it's the fast field updates. And the key thing here, fast field updates, just like before triggers, are faster. They're a lot faster because the record hasn't had to be saved and then try to update afterwards. And because it hasn't been saved, it's also probably not triggering any recursive actions. because Flow, one of the things it doesn't have the best of is the ability to manage recursion. That's what this Flow Explorer is a start on, though. And our last category is run asynchronously. And this run asynchronously came out in spring 22 as well. And the advantage here is that you can actually take a flow, specify an asynchronous path, and this is roughly akin to calling an invokable method or an queuable class with queuable methods. It's the same kind of thing, same basic logic under the hood. It is fire it off, and it goes and does things whenever the system has time, which is probably going to be fairly soon. So it's probably not too far off, but it's there. One of the ones that we had to do with this was we had at work, we were assigning a bunch of records a value, and it was coming from the child record to update back to the parent record. That was fine, except for we also have a lot of mass data loads on this object. So we didn't want to run it that way. Instead, what we did was we moved all that stuff to an asynchronous path. So it doesn't interfere with the data loads. It doesn't get overwhelmed. It doesn't run out of CPU issues. It doesn't lag on things. All it does is go ahead and drop it in place and pass it off to the next time that a queue is processing sets of data, and it runs through. 9 times out of 10, it is still done. Probably 99% of the time, it's still done before the record actually updates on screen. But it just is that asynchronous path, same as we're using with queuable and future methods.
Quick question, Mark. Like, does it come with any limitations, like how we have it in the number of future methods or queuable in a transaction, something?
There are some limits, and one of the things, I haven't had a chance to ask any of the product team about this yet. It is on my list because the scheduled flows, like I mentioned, scheduled has their own thing they work through, their own limits piece and their own stuff like that. I don't know if the same is true of the run asynchronously. Like, does it actually use the queuable infrastructure? Does it use the future method, whatever? Like, I don't know how that path runs and how it works. So I don't know if it's on its own thing. Now, it does still apply with the too many SOCL, too many DML statements. CPU runtime can also be affected. And I don't know, because of the limit, I don't know if it's like the usual asynchronous stuff where it actually has double the limits on SOCL queries, CPU time, and DML statements. So there are limits, but right now this is brand new, and I can't tell you exactly what those limits are. But I know it still follows the DML and SOCL limits. And I think this may be in its own runtime, so it may still have the same standard limits as a real-time transaction versus a asynchronous action in Apex.
Okay, got it.
Any other questions? Anything in the chat? I hope I'm not putting everyone to sleep here.
No, not at all, Mark. They're just talking about the unofficial SF database, and Fred shared a link to it.
we will touch on that in just a little bit.
Yeah, and Jaya has a question for you. She is asking, in SOCL, we use the in the where to retrieve, in the where clause to retrieve records. How can we achieve that in flows?
So with flows, I see that. Yes, that data table component is absolutely one of the things I'm talking about later here. So you absolutely can do a limit things, and let me try. All right, hope I'm not giving up any trade secrets here. I swear I won't show any of the Rad Women code stuff here, but it's the org that I know I can log into and get it open. So Critica, please don't report me.
No worries.
All right. Get out of the way. Okay. So you can limit your flows on intake here. So let's do, I think this is probably a good time to jump in for a little screen time here on this. This is our Flow Trigger Explorer. Excuse me. This is where we get to it. This is the one I just showed here. I don't really have any flows built in this org, so not much here to see on this one. My dev org that I was working with kind of had a password change, and my password manager kept the wrong password that I was using to provide it. And so bad things happened. When we start off with a new flow of any type here, and record triggered flow, for example, or schedule triggered flows, either one of these, we can actually limit what enters it right away. So if we come in here, we can specify entry criteria. It's not letting me put any entry criteria in right now because I haven't given it an object. Let's say I want to do it when a record is created, and I want to do it when we have this condition. So I've got the and, or, etc. I pick from here and I put in, and let's say I want my industry to be one of several options here. So I could do banking, and I could do, same thing here. I can do, right? And of course, this is going to give me an error message if I try to do this because, well, that's a single select pick list field. So I'd probably want to go into or for this one, or I can do the same custom logic where I can do this 1 and 2, 1 or 2, 1 and parentheses 2 or 3. So I have the same ability to limit the records that enter into the flow, enter into the schedule triggered flow, enter into a record triggered flow, etc. And this actually massively helps if you can do anything to filter out records to begin with. So if a particular record is a record changed, a record triggered flow, and it's looking for a specific field to have been changed, you can actually come in here and say, pick, all right, here. And, oh, I didn't pick a record triggered flow. But you can also get back to this from here. It gets a little funky and you're like, where did it go? Tap this, and you can get back to your criteria. You can jump to your Flow Trigger Explorer from here so you can see all the other flows that you might be contending with. It does not cover triggers at this point. So it does have a couple of advantages here over code, but you do have some flexibility. You have, depending on which ones here, you can also check this box, and that's the one that gives you the asynchronous path. Without that, you have no asynchronous path to work with. It's needing an object. All right. And then you have two paths, run immediately, run asynchronously. And so you can have them run two different things. You can have it do this, this, and this right away. You can have it do this, this, and this in an asynchronous fashion. But this is a great question as far as this goes. Depending on other things, for example, one of the advantages that can come in here, how many times have you ever wanted to give a user an option to do a certain thing that they can't normally do just really quick? One of the flows that I've built before that leverages this is a screen flow where people can add someone to a public group without needing admin, without needing delegated admin, without any other special permissions. Because what I do here is I created a flow. And in this flow, I did a screen flow. And it is, let's just throw a screen here. I think I have to do that before I do anything else. Give it a label. Okay. Again, we have our input fields here on our screen. So these are all the different things we can choose from out of the box. This lookup field is kind of useless, which is why this one has been extended. Again, unofficial SF to the rescue here. There is a quick lookup piece here that you can use, and you can do lots of things with it. You can't do it with the standard lookup field. This was created by an MVP, Eric Smith, who originally did it, and it's available in open source. So one of the lovely things about all these things on unofficial SF is the majority of them are also open source, and the majority of them have this source code and source code link here, so you can jump off to them and get an example of how someone did this, how this works, how that was done, etc., to get to a kind of a better point with things. So if I wanted to look at how this one came about, and we can look at that a little bit later, I've got that code to look at. I've got a great example of how this stuff works. One thing I dislike about Flow Builder is when you exit from a flow, it puts things back. And it just drops you on that screen back to the other one. All right. So I'm going to save. And now, let's say, we'll call it System Context Test. From this Show Advanced, I can say how to run the flow. So I can say user or system context depends on how flow is launched. I can say system context with sharing, so enforces all that record level access, but still gives them access to fields like they're a system user. And system context without sharing, so access all data. And so the way that I actually built things with a project, because we needed the admins to add to a group, I set a decision element into the flow that said, is it in this permission? Do they have this particular custom permission on their user? Custom permissions are awesome, by the way. If you're not using them, highly recommend looking them up. They can save you so much time because you can run them across permission sets, permission set groups. You can run them across your profiles, etc. And it doesn't matter. You only have to check if they have this permission. You do not have to care how they got it. So you can avoid doing the check if they have this profile or this profile or this profile, or if they have this permission set, this permission set, this permission set. And checking for permission sets is really not easy in a lot of the tools. You can't really do that in validation rules, etc. But these custom permissions you can use in formula fields, validation rules, flows, and Apex code. So I can check and see, is this someone that I'm allowing to be in here? So I'm going to allow them to see all the use, for example. I can give them a screen flow that can come in. You have some options to change these, but usually not. You can pick from a template out of the ones they have. I usually don't do that. You can check and see if this is overridable. This is essentially like you've published this. You have made it as your template out of the box. It's yours. You've got it. But you want the admin to be able to create a new version of it, but not be able to overwrite yours. And so they can update it slightly to change something, but they can't really change your stuff. This is a really handy functionality to have because you can specify it and say, okay, we've got this, but you may need to make a quick change. And I acknowledge you may have to make a quick change because we may have this text that we have to do. We may have this field that we have to hide. We've got to do it quickly. And rather than have us scramble, we have given you the option to create an override. You can do your version, but our version still exists. So we will run it through the same code review processes, QA processes, and deployment and testing process we have done in every other level. If you're looking for the interface that I had before where all these things are shown on the side, you can turn off the auto layout. Auto layout is pretty. They've been making a lot of effort on it, but there's some things that don't work the best with auto layout. So switch back and forth. Just keep in mind, freeform, you can do anything. You can draw things. You can put things there. You can stick stuff here and put anything in. Again, I'm just going to call this because it has it. I can specify whether it's a single or a collection. I can specify whether I use all the values from a record or just the separate resources where I can say It's this one is 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 this. Basically the same way as I might do an object notation, where we have that dot notation inside of my Apex code, where I set up and say account source equals this, account dot industry equals this, account dot whatever equals this. I can do the same things here by specifying this, or if I already set these up and it was based on the record originally and I've been referencing everything, I can just do this, save my time, and it'll be whatever resource I've used before. Because I don't have a get element in here, it's not letting me. But I can drag this around the page. I can do all kinds of crazy things with it. And it's going to give me this funky error message about I'm going to lose the unsaved positions. So just keep in mind, if you switch to the auto layout again, it will make it back into its pretty format, and you do everything in line where you pick and choose and you add and say, I've got this, I want this assignment, I want this piece here. We have all of that here for flows. So this is kind of our intro and context. Any questions before we kind of jump over to the yes, Eric is definitely owed a beer, similar to the many that are owed by Steve Mullis. I actually got to be there after TDX or Dreamforce once, when a group of like 15 people decided to pay back their beers all at once to Steve Mullis. So he had a group of about 15 people just literally hand him beers right at the same time. He was amused, but not really as receptive to that way of getting his owed beers. But any other questions we have here before we jump into a little bit more of the code side of this? No questions? Okay. At least it's either some chat bots in there in that chat, and I don't think Bevy's that advanced, or there's still some people that I have not put to sleep yet. So
you're doing great, Mark.
I think we're going to run out of time for the session here, but let's try to touch on some things here before calling out. So as everyone mentioned here, unofficial SF. So much useful information. So one of my favorites here is if you're trying to do a flow action with Apex, this is a really useful piece of here. There is a video that you can reference to get to this that will walk you through it if you're more on the visual side. It helps. I know sometimes when I'm working with something and trying to do it the first time, I kind of like to have my iPad or a second screen or whatever open with a YouTube, and I'm kind of following along with it. So you can have this. But this is a basic action where an invokable interface is set up. And we have a get random number, unique name of get random number that we've given it. We give it names that are what it presents to the interface in the flow builder. We give it unique names that are the API names, so to speak, so that we can tell elements apart when we reference them. This has no inputs. It just has an output of a random number because, we didn't go with that. We could have put in an input variable where we said how large of a random number we want. Did we want, it to be 1 to 10, 1 to 100, what that range was? We could have come up with some input variables to feed into this one, but this is a super basic one. And one of the advantages here, though, on this is, am I looking for this? This understanding invokable actions here. So this one has a lot of the code. So when you add an action, it comes up with this screen. These do not tell anything. If you change categories, it does nothing. I wish it did, but all it changes is what you can search for up here. So my recommendation is, one, Salesforce just gives up on this and either makes it what people think it is, where if I click all, I get a list of all. If I click Quip, I get a list of only the ones for Quip, etc. Or they just do away with the side because it's kind of not helpful. But you search in here for which actions you have. Want to know how many actions you have available? Yeah, there's no list. I'm sorry. You literally just have to click there and scroll through the whole thing without typing anything. It's a bad UX. They know about this. It's been brought up. I think they're looking at how to fix this, but we can set any input values that have been specified. So in this case, we have Twilio, which has a message service. This is a really cool one if you want to play around with, because Twilio has a really basic free SMS service that you can use. You have a limit on how many you can send, et cetera, what you can do with them, but there is a service out there that works with this for sending and receiving SMS messages. And what we're doing is a message body and the to number. So think about getting a flow where it's processed through and gone through and gotten all the records that had an renewal opportunity. And we want to send them a text message to say, hey, your renewal is coming up right now. Do you want to book an appointment with our people? And also send an email that way with a scheduled flow that says, okay, this, and this criteria. If this happens, follow this path. And if it's this, send a text. If it's this, send an email, et cetera, right? Because you have your consent to send them text messages about stuff for GDPR. Creating them is an interesting thing. So one of the things that was before with Process Builder, you could put stuff into those fields for inputs. You could have multiple inputs, but no output. It didn't return anything back to the Process Builder. With Flow, you can have that, and that is super cool. So you basically add an invokable method interface to one of the methods, and then you start defining your input and output variables that you're exposing. And so if we look quickly here. Okay, so this is my when to flow, when to code. So when you go pro code, there are certain areas that are here to be dragons. And this means you either need to switch completed to code, and it may be trigger framework and queuable and services and other things like that, batch Apex, scheduled Apex, whatever. Or cases where you have a lot of existing code. If you have a complex trigger on an object, don't introduce a record triggered flow. Do a screen flow to update and change it while a user works through it. Don't do a record triggered flow. Don't do a platform event triggered flow. Probably don't do a scheduled trigger flow on it if you're doing anything that changes the record. So there's a couple of scenarios where you really don't go flow, you want to go code. Outside of those, though, what you may want to do is go with the actions or lightning components. So the invokable method has a couple things around it. You specify the method as invokable, and you can specify in variables as invokable. And any variable that is invokable, you can use in your input, or you can use them in your output fields, and you can get them and reference that. So if at any point in time I put in my action that's convert lead action request, and I want to get back and get the contact ID for the account, I can do that. I can get that and put it into collection and send an email of, these are all the leads that we converted today. These are all the account IDs we converted today from this lead. I can get that information back and reference it just like I would a variable inside here. I can reference that action in place, and I can then pull that in. You can also specify what's required. Big deal, because you can't necessarily specify what's required in the interface there for the invokable method unless you have put it here in the code. The interface that someone gets to call this action is not going to show required as true, and they can't make it show required as true if this is not already written as required as true here in your Apex code. Because that little front end is nothing more than a gateway towards what variables you've set up. So in a case where we were dealing with vaccinations for COVID at work, we have an invokable method that deals with calculating their immunity status, which has to go across multiple potential objects and span multiple child records of the person and other things, and touch against a bunch of logic that varies depending on which vaccine they had, which doses they've had, how far apart the doses were. that was way too complex to build into a flow. It would have been slow and clunky and lots of loops. And we built it as an invokable action. And from there, we return things like, are they fully vaccinated or have they completed their primary cycle is one Boolean variable that we return. We have a latest dose return, booster shot returned, vaccination up to date returned as far as this goes for these. And these are all things that we return from our invokable action in Apex. And in our flow, we reference them just like we would any other element. Just like you could say, I reference this lookup field on a screen component. I can touch on this action and say, okay, everything this action turned back and its results. Again, you have to be clear on what it is because it may be collections if you're returning something. It may be others. But one of the things is you don't really need to necessarily account for that unless you're explicitly calling it for a collection of records that you're feeding into it. You don't need to deal with getting a collection of records back out of your Apex code. This really, really helps to make things more flexible. And because it's code, you can include all kinds of things. You can include like an operation type there. You can provide back like 10 different variables that are related to this they can reference in their flow and not have to ask. And you can go and say, oh, we've got something new. Okay, let me just add a new invocable variable in. The other thing is these do all have to be global. And that has the same limitations that come with a global variable. You can't use them anywhere else. They are no context you can have everywhere else. But you can do this with a global variable and put it in and use all the different types from Apex to define what things you can return with your code. And I've seen in some cases where people set up an Apex class, similar kind of a trigger handler framework where the parent class has nothing but the exposed variables and methods in it. And then there's a utility class that has the actual methods that do the work. And so your variables call a method in your utility class. That's probably the most common pattern that I've seen if you're getting more advanced in flow or in your Apex code that you're using is invocable, but it's not necessary. Any questions on invocable actions before we move on to custom lightning components? Yes, auto layout is the ability of anyone to look at the flow and understand it. It's always laid out the same. So I really like auto layout. I tend to do things like when you have to remap stuff, I switch back to the freeform layout when I have to like change lines around. Like if I built something over here and I built it all up under this and then I find out it needs to be asynchronous, there's not necessarily the greatest ways of moving things between things in the builder. You can do it, but it's really clunky. I usually prefer to switch back to freeform, redraw my line so I know what's happening here, and then boom, it's there, it's back. I can delete lines, I can add them, etc. I can move an element out, I can move an element in. The other place where I use the freeform is debugging, because a lot of cases I will create a specific screen that's a debug screen, and I like to drop it in different places in the flow to see how things are changing as I walk through to figure out why it's not doing what I thought I told it to do. All right, no other questions here. So I know we are coming up towards the end of time. I want to kind of jump through some things here to get into with our custom lightning components here. So in our flow builder, when we're working with Screenflows, we can have custom lightning components that we can have in our Screenflows. Oh, Critica, I'm actually thinking this could be a good rad code project. One of the monthly projects is to build a Apex action for a flow that does certain things.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great idea, Mark.
Yep. And there's a bunch of things that are here for these that are sort of out of the box. A lot of stuff that you'll see if you're in a dev org is things that are related to field service and other stuff that's related to omnichannel and appointment management, stuff like that. But, you know, a lot of these come up as sort of not the greatest to work with. So your display is you have display text that shows it, or you have a section where you can split lines. There's not a whole lot. There's this fields beta. This, in theory, is like dynamic forms for flow. And practice its dynamic forms for flow because it's still in beta. It's horribly broken in a lot of ways and will leave you frustrated to no end. I highly don't recommend using it. But we can build custom components that can do all kinds of things that we would normally want to do. So, for example, one of the things that I've done, if you're using a form that sits outside of Salesforce and hosted on Visualforce, if you're in Lightning and in a Experience Cloud site, your limitation on files is that lovely 2 GB using the standard file upload component. If you are hosting that in a Visualforce page, because it's an externally available form, your maximum is like 2.5 megs. How many of us can blow past a limit of 2.5 megabytes with a picture from our current phone? Yeah. So we made our own custom file upload component, and we did some work with that custom file upload component that it passes things off to a VF code page using a custom controller that basically chunks up the attachment from the component on the flow, drops it in place on the file at the end of the process. So, we can work with it from that perspective. Other things I've seen here are, file upload. You can make it so that you can specify the related record after the fact. That's a real common one. Right now, you have to do, if you have a screen that has a bunch of stuff on it and you're collecting all this information, then you also want to get a file, you have to specify the record for that. So you honestly have to actually create a record before you launch the screen that's asking for all the details. And then once that's done, you can save it and save the updated details afterwards to the file and not have to essentially ask those details beforehand. This is seriously clunky because if something happens with that flow, you have to end up going back and redoing it. I don't like doing this. There are lots of Screenflows that are out there. This lookup one is a really good handy one. And then really the most amazing one ever is this data table flow. And it's a fantastic thing. I think there's also a article on here on making custom LWCs for there's a bunch of different articles out here. I think there's one on Unofficial SF that here we go. That's really quite good from Alex Edelstein, who's on the product management team. And basically the key things that you have here to make it available is in your LWC bundle, that XML file that defines where it can be used, you add the target Lightning flow screen. The other thing that you have to do with this is you would add in your target configures, basically. So can it be used here? Can it be used there? Can it be used for whatever? You have to make sure that any variables you're adding come in from an existing class where you're sharing it out. So you get that record ID that can be fed into it from your API. You can get the other things in from it from there. And you can use generic S objects as well, which is new. There's a bunch of articles here that I recommend following for this and looking at it. But it's a lot the same as any other flow or any other Lightning component you're using anywhere else. There's just a couple changes you do to make it available for working in flow. And so this one is a basic test contact flow. And all it does is display some contact information. That's it. It's a really basic one. It's not really interactive, but you can kind of see what happens here, see how things work, and work through that. This is really kind of a cool tutorial. It's helpful. I think there's also a YouTube video on walking through this. I think there is actually on the developer evangelist site, there's one of their recipes that has actually a Lightning component that's built into Flow. But the ultimate one that everyone has been talking about here, this is the data table by Eric Smith. This uses things that even Salesforce wasn't doing with a lot of their Flow components. So you'll notice the usual Flow interface when you add a component is you add it and it looks like this. So file upload label, accepted formats, allow multiple files, disabled. Disabled. What do I do here? I get a text box and I get to pick false or true. It also lets me pick all sorts of other things, which will break that because that is a Boolean value, but it's giving me no information. Great if that would be great if it could show as a text box, right? It doesn't. It doesn't. But the much fancier Lightning data table by Eric Smith is a really full functioning data table. The only things it doesn't have right now are the pick list settings where it's record type available in inline editing and lookup fields. That's something that is coming at some point in the future, but is not there. You can have a really basic data table that does this. You can have an output only data table, but there is this amazing thing for being able to customize your tables and give an interface to your admins that's much more intuitive, because this is not intuitive. Almost every admin I've ever known goes, well, I can't make it required. Yes, you can. Well, how do you make it required? Well, you go to the place where it says required, and then you go down and you say string global constant equals true. What? Yeah, string global constant dot false. String global constant dot true. What's a string? Wait, what are you? No, lost. This custom property editor, which is only available in Flow Lightning components, needs to be available everywhere that Lightning web components are. But this is actually a special type of Lightning web component. And the idea being you can actually really customize the display. So you can have an object selector that draws it in, puts it into a pick list, as opposed to that text box that maybe pre-fills. You can have a checkbox there. You can have pill format to specify which ones you have. You can say which are already selected here. You can do this configure columns, and this actually launches a flow that from that flow, you can actually pick which fields you need to put in this record. This is thoroughly cool. You can do things you cannot do with most other data tables for custom-related lists. You can pick field values as attributes. So I can say I can have an icon hidden here in a field that I say, I can use a formula field that says, if it's this and this, the icon name is action : clone. If it's this and this, the icon name is utility : constant, right? And so it's going to display that value here because of what we've got there. And it's getting that icon from the icon value field, but it's also getting other stuff. I can do formatting here by specifying where that is. So I can say in here with formula fields or flow formulas where I can actually put it and say, this is what I should show. And it has that there. This is extremely cool, super versatile, literally like a superpower. Just, I can't tell you how flexible this thing is to be able to solve a lot of problems. You want a custom related list component that needs to do this, and this, and you need to be different. You can do it with this component inside of a flow in ways that would be super hard to do anywhere near as quickly using the standard Lightning data table base component, because that Lightning data table base component is broke. It is not a good component. It's deficient in functionality in like at least a dozen ways. But the really fantastic thing here, you can jump off to GitHub and get the code. You can see how all of it's made. You can see how all of it's put together. A lot of documentation that Eric has done about how this is put together and assembled. So if you ever have to make your own or want to see how something is set up, a lot of this code is right out there and in this Alex Edelstein's, who again, product manager, he's assembled a lot of these things that are contributed by members of the community, members of the product team that's trying to work with an experiment on something, everyone up under the sun. And you can jump right in here and see this is what the layout looks like. And, this is what that CPE code looks like. So it's similar to your everyday LWCs. You have your elements that you would have there. You have individual pieces where you're grabbing from other stuff. It looks just like your others. It's just you're specifying in a certain way. The key thing that makes this a CPE versus others really is in the way that you work with stuff on a file. There's a couple things that you put in from a header there that makes it a custom CPE and goes with your flow component. And I really want to see this technology take off across everything. But again, your JavaScript is there. This is where you kind of bring in some of the magic because you have to import certain things from a couple places and other stuff like that to work with. But for the most part, it's pretty straightforward and clean code, easy to read. Super useful, super helpful. And with that, we are at the end of what I have for tonight. Any questions? Any other things?
There's a question in chat. I think you're saying that, yeah.
Okay, so yes. So one thing I'm seeing is data table version 3.5.0 was just released today. It actually takes advantage of some stuff that's in pilot. So you can have reactive screens. That means two components in a flow can actually send messages and talk to each other and pass stuff back and forth. That's roughly equivalent to like sending messages by Lightning message service between two components in your regular development. So when that comes about, this will be really huge for being able to produce a admin manageable, customizable interface. So you can link your data table and a search box component and have the two of them put there and in a purely declarative fashion say, okay, this passes this over here, this passes this over there, and the two of them can work together. It's super cool. Looking really forward to that being available. To hear the typical flow components and types and equivalent in code. I don't know of any blog post that does that, and maybe I should actually write one since I've actually put it out and laid it out here for this. It would probably be helpful to people, but I haven't written that, and I don't know of any other blog that tries to break this down and put it this way. I know Bonnie, she had put together a session, and she was the one who opened my eyes that Flow is a model view controller programming language. She did that at one of her talks somewhere, and I'm like, wait, what? But I haven't seen anything where it kind of breaks these down and compares the relative pieces between code and the individual elements. But I think maybe now that you mentioned it, that'll be something I will probably write to go along with this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your knowledge about flows. This was super useful and definitely something that I will start using more and more in my projects.
I think it's great because one of the things I like about it is that if you build some stuff that's reusable, you spend your time as a developer working on stuff that's more productive for you and less of this could be done by an admin, but because of this, it can't be, or because of that, it can't be, or because of whatever, it can't be, It really can be kind of a life changer when you switch and go, okay, I'm going to start doing this, this, and this because I'm building flexibility in. I am building sanity for myself by making things reusable for you so that you can take and do this stuff with it and I don't have to touch it every time someone on the business side says, oh, we want to add a new field. Can you change this? Oh, we need to check this, this, and this, but we can't do that with a validation rule because it talks to 17 different child objects. Yep.
Awesome. Karan, did you have anything to say? I know we're kind of over time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark. Really, it's really helpful about your presentation. Even I learned about that. You shared the tips about the data layout and the freeform. So how when you switch and when you switch back. So that really helpful. Like definitely, I hope it's helpful for all the attendees as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Looking forward for the more session from you in the future events as well.
Yeah, I'm hoping to start doing a session in the near future on troubleshooting flows, because your troubleshooting options for flows are not anywhere near as efficient as like your system.debug and other stuff like that.
Yep.
So you have to get really creative with troubleshooting your flows sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining today. So see you all soon in the next. Thank you. Thanks again, Kritika and Mark. So thank you.
Thank you all.
For having me.
Thank you.
And I know there was a bunch of different backgrounds for everyone, so I hope everyone managed to find something that was useful to them at least.
This is great. Thank you all. Looking forward to having another presentation next month. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.